stuff is great. They ought to advertise it.
And they did advertise it. And they still do. On billboards, in the mail, and now in email, on web pages, in the movies with product placement, on the phone from pesky telemarketers, in public schools, on Channel 1, on TV and radio.
So you can buy your new tires in time to turn around and get on to your next errand.
Advertising, in one form or another, saturates American culture. According to one study, the average adult comes across thousands of commercial messages in the course of a day. Children watch about 30,000 TV commercials a year. If you add it all up, Americans spend about 2 years of their lives watching commercials. Advertising today is so much a part of everyday life that we're not even surprised to find it in the most unlikely places, as historian Stuart Ewan discovered.
I was at the movies the other day. I looked down in the urinal, and there's an advertising message on this little strainer to keep cigarette butts out of the urinal. And I thought, but that was a good one to move in on. I had always been bothered by the fact that there weren't commercial messages there.
Modern product advertising really got going only after the Civil War.
Before you can have advertising, you have to have a surplus of product. So really, what you had before the Civil War was tobacco, escaped slaves, land for sale, and you would have seen it probably in crude newspapers, maybe on crude billboards, but before the Civil War, not much advertising in American culture.
Many products advertised in the 1870s and 80s were items for everyday life: blankets, boots, watches, farm implements. But the most heavily advertised product of the era was the patent medicine. Walker Bingham is an historian of patent medicine advertising.
Some patent medicines were simply a sweet-tasting flavoring, some sugar, plenty of water, and then most of them had some alcohol to give it a kick, make you feel good. Now others, of course, contained chloroform, various narcotics, opium, morphine, cocaine, and these things made the patient feel better. And the idea was, well, if he got rid of his symptoms and he felt better, well, he liked it. It was doing some good.
The most incredible aspect of 19th and early 20th century advertising for me is that early advertisers came disproportionately from people who had either been ministers or who had trained for the ministry, or best yet, whose father had been a minister. It's almost as if they knew the lingo, they knew the importance of large promise. They knew that the way you sell goods is to make a claim that it will change your life, and that it wasn't difficult to jump the language of Christian redemption and settle it onto mass-produced objects.
The magic elixir places itself in the same role as the conversion experience, and the patent medicine becomes a kind of liquid grace.
Since the elixirs were pretty interchangeable, clearly what was being consumed was the magical promise. And this is really where the phenomenon of you consume the advertising, not the product, starts.
Products otherwise indistinguishable from each other are often the most heavily advertised. Advertising provides what the industry calls added value. George Lois, who has been in the ad business for 45 years, explains.
You could see any Burger King commercial over the years, and it looks like the happiest experience in the world when you go in there. When you go into a Burger King, it's like dreadful, I did it twice in my life, for some reason. And you walk in, it's Jesus Christ, what a house, But imagery in the commercials has changed the attitude of what actually happens in cases like that,
It was from this that the manufacturers understood that if they could brand literally now, not just the package, but the object, so that you actually stuck your name into the bar of soap or onto the biscuit, that you could then advertise to the end user, and the end user would walk into the retailer and say to the grocer, "Don't sell me any soap, sell me the Ivory soap." Just look at all the prescription ads that are advertised. So the patient will walk into his doctor and say, "Write me a prescription for Prozac," instead of the doctor saying, "Here, I'll give you a prescription for a mood elevator." And that phenomenon is deep in advertising.
I think you can really see the origins of a modern consumer culture in the middle to later 19th century, because it's during that period that there's a psychological change, there's an intensification of the promises of magical self-transformation, coming primarily from the patent medicine vendors, but also the vendors of tobacco, cosmetics, clothing, perfumes, etc.
The 1880s and 90s saw the phenomenal growth of popular magazines like the Saturday Evening Post and the Ladies' Home Journal. These magazines were cheaper than highbrow journals like Harper's, mainly because they were full of advertisements.
In early magazines, the magazine publisher felt that he had a responsibility to protect the reader from the sort of vulgarity that the commercial advertisement represented. So very often they would box them all up in small ghettos in the back of the, as they called it, the back of the book. And it was only when advertisers were able to jump loose and get right in with the text, so that as you were reading it, you couldn't escape the ad, that the advertiser really was able to get a good grip on the reader. Strangely enough, at every point where great innovations occur and advertisers claim new territory inside a medium, the audience is remarkably quiet. The people who screamed were the editors and the publishers, who saw their comfy relationship with their reader being co-opted. But the readers were not distressed. It almost betrays the fact that most advertising, most of the time, doesn't bother most of the people.
There's that whole question of whether advertising revenues have become so important to a publication's very existence that you can no longer speak of an independent journalism. And around the turn of the century, a lot of progressive reformers were beginning to raise those questions, and they seem to have slipped away completely from our public discourse now. But long live the critique. I think it's central to understanding what our culture is about. We can't really understand the evening news unless we're fully aware that it's brought to us by General Electric or Archer Daniels Midland.
Contributors also include Dow Jones, featuring Dow Jones Interactive.
It doesn't mean that we're going to find a smoking gun that demonstrates an outrageous instance of influence. The influence is much more diffuse and pervasive than that.
Advertisers, for their part, have often claimed credit for modernizing Victorian attitudes about sex. But Lears sees something else at work here.
With all of the rhetoric of sexual liberation that advertising dallies with in the 20th century, there is a kind of underlying Puritanism, it seems to me. Sex is integrated into this managerial ethos of personal efficiency and peak performance at all times, which is concerned above all about the systematic organization of one's personal and public life. The emphasis is on life as a kind of continuous, systematic treadmill of effort and exertion, but we have these products, we have these moments that we can step aside and take a break.
We have canvassed hundreds of
The chief motivating force in many of the advertisements was guilt. Women were told, that if they didn't feed their children certain kind of cereal in the morning, or if they didn't use a certain kind of soap, if they didn't send them to school in a certain kind of shoes, that somehow they had failed their children, they were no longer good mothers.
Apparently, nobody thought seriously about selling advertising. But on August 28, 1922, a Mr. Blackwell stepped up to the microphone at WEAF in New York City. He had paid $100 for 10 minutes of airtime.
It is 58 years since Nathaniel Hawthorne, the greatest of American fictionists, passed away. To honor his memory, the Queensboro Corporation.
Mr. Blackwell was advertising apartments in Hawthorne Court in Queens, New York. The apartments sold out within 3 weeks. James Twitchell.
It was from this transcending experience that advertisers finally realized, wait a minute, this is a medium which can be much better used to sell ears to manufacturers than to sell components for producers.
One thing that radio did was that it meant that everybody's home could be turned into a sales room without the requirement of literacy, without the work of having to read through a long advertising text.
Stuart Ewan is a media historian.
But another thing that radio did is, for example, the emergence of the jingle. Little snippets of sound which would embed themselves in the unconscious lives of consumers who would all of a sudden hear themselves humming the tunes that bubbled up while they were, mowing the lawn or whatever they were doing.
Fletcher's Milwaukee's finest beer.
And the idea was that the most powerful forms of communication are not the ones which make rational arguments to people, but those that sort of touch people in their gut, in their unconscious lives. And for an advertiser, touching people very deeply and often bypassing their cognitive or their critical faculties is a prime goal. Radio made that more possible.
Ask your mother to let you have a cereal you'll really like.
Children were seen in many ways as this sort of fifth column within the home. If you could get the kids demanding the clothes that come out off the rack that little Johnny or little Janie is wearing, demanding the canned goods or packaged food or various other things, then on some level what they were doing was to try and use parental love as a merchandising technique. I think that that's still a standard thing. A lot of what advertising was about between, say, 1910 and the end of the 20s was, in fact, an attempt to sort of break down old ways of seeing the fabric of survival and encouraging people to sort of reimagine success and survival and the dealing with sort of personal and familial needs through the framework of the consumer marketplace.
Ewan's point is that consumers are made, not born. He says that for many Americans in the first decades of the 20th century, especially farm workers and immigrants, buying products off the shelf was not a normal way of life.
You're talking about this huge plurality of people in the United States which rigidly resisted the idea that, one should eat tomatoes out of a can, or one should buy clothing off the rack.
So, according to Ewan, advertisers deliberately promoted consumerism as a mode of life. Jackson Lears disagrees.
I don't want to suggest that deep in the bowels of market culture, maybe somewhere beneath Madison Avenue where the ad agencies used to be clustered, conspiracies are being hatched, and ad executives are sitting around trying to puzzle out how to promote consumerism. They're not. Consumerism is an unintended consequence, I would argue, of what are basically very short-range, market-driven campaigns that are designed to keep or get good clients for the agency.
Well, I think to some extent what he's saying is true, but it's rather ahistorical. There have been certain moments in history where advertisers do see themselves as trying to create consumers.
One of those advertisers, says Ewan, was Ernest Calkins. Calkins took the idea of continually changing styles from the world of high fashion and applied it to everyday consumer items, like bathroom scales, cigarettes, and cars.
Products which were perfectly good were being outmoded because they identified the owner as being out of date. As Calkins put it, styles wear out faster than gear.
By the early 1930s, the new radio networks NBC and CBS gave advertisers unprecedented access to a vast national audience. The programs were often produced by the ad agencies, which would contract with the manufacturers to sponsor the programs, and then with the networks to broadcast them. Again, James Twitchell.
Very often the commercials were not broken off into pods, but were actually made part of the program, so that if you were Ivory Soap, you could actually have your characters on the soap opera be discussing their love life and then quickly segue to discussing some quality of Ivory Soap.